Um, yeah, I mean, basically, I'm an arrogant bastard. I think
Okay.
I'm right, and if a million people scream at me because they have fashionable opinions, then I think they're all just doing this because they want to show each other that they're on the fashionable side of the argument. What Britain gets wrong is something fairly basic. Britain doesn't build anything, right? Britain doesn't build houses. Britain doesn't build infrastructure. Britain doesn't generate energy.
Do we really have space to keep building large numbers of houses?
Yes, absolutely. That's why all the old studies from the 2010s and before find that migration is broadly positive for the economy and that most migrants are net contributors. That was the case by design. Whereas if you then, and that's what Boris Johnson did, if you lower the threshold to below the median salary and you have lots of people coming in who earn less than the median salary but are entitled to some public services, then fewer of those will be net contributors.
Well, welcome, Dr. Kristian Niemietz from the IEA. Thank you so much for finding some time this morning to chat with me. I'm indebted.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Kristian, I'm an academic, so automatically I'm supposed to have quite different views, I think, to you on
Mm-hmm.
economics. Is that that's what one might predict with no further information. I'm not sure what my views are on economics. I'm not an economist, and I admit I don't know much about it. But hopefully, I and others are going to learn some more from listening to your good self. We did speak a little bit just sort of before I started officially recording, and having watched some videos of you online recently, I get the impression that you and your colleagues at the IEA, you have broadly similar views. Obviously, that's why you're a collective. You're pushing back. Your views are pretty counter to at least what the current government in the UK is doing, and I suspect previous governments, even though the political stance of the government has, in principle at least, changed quite dramatically in the last year. We went from a Conservative government to a Labour government. So I think the first thing I'd ask you is, are you despondent in the fact that many of the ideas that you have about how the economy should be run are quite different from what consecutive governments are proposing to do and do with the economy?
I mean, yeah, it's clearly not ideal. I would prefer to live in a world where my ideas are more popular uh, and are actually implemented and become actual policy. But that's clearly not the world we live in, and I don't think it ever was. So there was, of course, a time in the 1980s, 1990s when free market ideas were, I wouldn't say in fashion, but where when they were more broadly, more widely accepted. So you had obviously on the political right, the Thatcherism project and Reaganomics in the US, and weaker echoes of that elsewhere. And then in the 1990s, you had center-left parties, mainstream center-left parties in much of the Western world broadly accepting the more market-based settlement and saying, but we want to use some of the proceeds of that for left-wing aims, for progressive aims. So that's where the whole Blairism, the third way came in, and Clinton in the US. So that was probably a better time to be a free marketeer, but that was in a sense the aberration. So I mean, essentially, free markets are just very counterintuitive. We It doesn't come naturally to us to think in those terms, to think in terms of an economy where you have a division of labor and where you have lots of people doing their own thing, mostly pursuing their own interests, and that or the idea what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, that you can do things for your own interest that ends up benefiting other people. That's just not the way we think. We have evolved in small groups and tribes, and we still have the mental apparatus of a caveman, basically. And that's why most economic findings are counterintuitive to us. We want to organize society, a large scale society, in the same way our ancestors organized their little tribe, just with added technology. And that's why being a free marketeer is never going to be a mainstream opinion.
But Christian, we live in the country, the UK, which was probably first and foremost in developing the ideas of the free market and international trade and
Mhm.
so forth. And we have an awful lot of information now at our fingertips about what works and what doesn't work. Moreover, I think I'm right in saying, you of course correct me if I'm wrong, that over the last couple of centuries, broadly speaking, we've been more free market, more right of centre, if you like, economically than, say, France. And
Mhm.
yet our economies are broadly the same size with
Yes,
broadly the same population.
yes.
So the long-term test of this would suggest that it's no better than a more socialist stance.
I'd say the difference between Britain and France is that Britain gets some of the difficult things right. So if you think about some of the privatizations that happened in the 1980s, these are the large scale ones, say in the aviation industry. These are things that you can quite easily get wrong as well. And where, say, the former Soviet Union did get it wrong, Russia in the 1990s, that would be a case where a project like that went horribly wrong and where it led to corruption and the forming of an oligarchy. Britain got a lot of the difficult things right. And also this Britain has one advantage that Britain has compared to France is that it has, at least for now, had a more flexible labor market. These are things where that are difficult to reform because every time a French government tries to do something, they have mass protests because you always have short-term losers, even if it is the right thing to do in the longer term. But there are also things that France gets right, that Britain gets wrong. And I'd say these are outside of this dichotomy, whether you want to think of a market economy versus a more interventionist economy. What Britain gets wrong is something fairly basic. Britain doesn't build anything, right? Britain doesn't build houses. Britain doesn't build infrastructure. Britain doesn't generate energy. And that's because we have a land use planning system which gives a lot of room to, well, NIMBY interest groups that try to shut things down, to try to block things. And that's not something which really fits into the market versus interventionism framework very well. That's simply something that has developed over time. There was never a government that deliberately came up with the idea, let's create a system where professional obstructionists can block everything. Nobody ever said that would be a great way to run a country. That's just something that accumulated over time. And it's led to this situation where Britain now deprives itself, basically, of a lot of the input factors that you need for thriving a successful economy, because economic activity needs to take place somewhere. You need office buildings, you need premises, you need, say, if we think of the life sciences in the Oxford-Cambridge arc, they need lab space, things like that. You need buildings, you need the infrastructure around it, and Britain doesn't provide enough of that. So Britain throttles itself by deliberately rationing these key input factors. France doesn't do that. France builds a lot more houses than Britain does. They have a lot more infrastructure, so the road network per population, the generation of energy, nuclear energy in particular. France does very well on all that, and I'd say it's not that the economic system doesn't matter. I'd say if France, on top of getting these things right, if they also had a more lightly regulated labor market, a smaller public sector, lower taxes, France could do even better than they do now. If they adopted some of the good bits of Britain, they would be a much richer economy than Britain is. Or conversely, if we kept the relatively flexible labor market, or ideally liberalized it further, if we kept the, well, compared to France at least, smaller state, and if on top of that, we also made it possible to build on the scale that France does, Britain would be vastly more successful than France is economically. So on an other things equal basis, I'd say it is clearly true that more market-based, more laissez-faire economies are doing better, but other things aren't equal. You are comparing one economy that deprives itself of all the key input factors, and you're comparing it to an economy which gets these things right, which does provide the infrastructure and the housing and the energy. And okay, yes, these two are roughly similar in terms of overall outcomes. But I wouldn't ascribe that specifically to differences in economic policy, or at least, well, I mean, the things that I mentioned, house building, infrastructure, energy, that's also economic policy, but that's not economic policy in the way in which we usually talk about this. The way we talk about this is still very much conditioned by the ideological battles of the 1980s, high taxes versus low taxes, a highly regulated labor market versus a lightly regulated one. And these were the big battles then in the 1980s. We still think of policy often in those terms, but whereas I'd say nowadays that is no longer really the main dividing line. Nowadays, I see the main division in British politics clearly between NIMBYs and YIMBYs, the people who want to build stuff and the people who try to block it. And that's a debate in the US as well. There's this book, Abundance, that has been making a lot of waves. And essentially we have, that's a topic which plays an even bigger role here. That should be an even bigger discussion here than it is in the US, because in the US, it's specific areas that suffer from similar problems. Here, it's the whole country.
So when people say in the UK, maybe flippantly, we don't build anything, that really is true in the sense that relative to other comparator nations, for example, France, perhaps, for example, Germany, and I suspect you know Germany well, maybe all of these countries tend to throttle themselves a bit with NIMBYism, but you're saying that quantitatively, Britain is worse
Yes.
at building big infrastructure, whether it's, you know, big, I don't know, factories or lots of houses or motorways or whatever, that they are worse quantitatively than many other comparator countries. That's interesting. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We can see that in the data. If you just look at house building rates, the rate at which the housing stock grows, or the number of homes built per 1,000 people, the housing stock here is a lot smaller relative to the population size. And the few housing units that we have here are also smaller on average. So this isn't just an impression. This isn't just because I follow lots of NIMBYs on Twitter and are exposed, and I'm exposed to that. It's not just the availability bias. We can really see that in the data, and it's been going on for quite some time.
Right, okay. Because it's a long time ago that, but in the 1930s, I think a lot of houses were built in the UK.
Yes.
And in the 1950s and 60s, relatively a lot of nuclear power stations were built and so forth. And I get the impression that in the 50s and 60s, building out after the war and so forth, there was a lot of emphasis on building and development and recovery. But maybe from sort of the 70s onwards, and even during the Thatcher era, there just wasn't enough building, and that's got worse and worse as more and more regulations have come online and so forth. Well, okay, that's interesting. Well, this leads me on to, so, you know, I'm a non-economist. I follow a few people on the YouTube and various things and listen to various people talking about economics who know a lot more about it than I do. And it was staggering to me to learn that in June of this year alone, the UK borrowed more than 20 billion pounds. So in other words, it spent 20 plus billion more than it kind of generated. I think that's fair. And another statistic that seems staggering, but again, comes back to the point I made earlier. Sometimes one thinks these numbers seem big, but then a country's big, right? And also these numbers seem big, but maybe it's the case everywhere. So it may not be good, but it's not particularly a British thing. But the other big statistic on top of that, and I know there are other ones too, is that something like 3,000 people a day, working day, so this excludes weekends, 3,000 people a day are going on to benefits. Now, I think benefits is a very broad term, so there is a caveat there. But I guess my question is that really bad? Are those sort of statistics, the increase in national debt, and the rate that people are going on to benefits, whatever exactly that means, are those bad? And what's likely to happen if those trends continue, in your view?
Well, okay, I'll start with the second one. So the number of people claiming out of work benefits, you could say it's not necessarily higher than the OECD average, or maybe it is now marginally, but it's not that the British situation is uniquely bad there. So that's true. It's just that Britain was starting from a better place. So before the pandemic, Britain had one of the highest employment rates in the OECD. Relatively fewer working age people being economically inactive.
Was that,
And
beg your pardon,
that has,
Christian? Sorry, I do apologise. Was that really unemployment or employment rates? Because I've heard that sometimes actually those numbers are confounded by whether people are claiming benefits or not. So you can have people that are inactive and not studying, but therefore aren't in the figures. So there was a concern that the unemployment rate in the UK seemed to be lower than it really was, depending on how you interpreted being unemployed.
okay, I'm not talking about the official unemployment rate, but rather employment rates. What proportion of the working age population are in some form of gainful
Okay.
employment? So if that figure is high, and you also have a low official unemployment rate, then you could say the country is probably doing something right.
Okay.
And Britain was doing quite well on those figures before the pandemic. It's still not catastrophically bad. But what has happened since then is that the number of people claiming, in particular, disability and incapacity benefits has gone up a lot by, I think, 1 million or so, or more. And there's just no obvious reason why that should happen. It's not that any measures of population health have got drastically worse. And it's also true that Britain is, in that respect, an outlier if we look at the rate of increase. So it's not that Britain is, in absolute terms, worse than everyone else. Clearly not. It's roughly in line with the average. But if you have a country that starts from a better place and then after a few years is about as bad as everyone else, then you still have a trend of relative decline, a trend of relative deterioration. And that's still something to be concerned about. Now, I don't know what exactly the answer is to that, because the problem with any kind of policy that tries to tighten access to those benefits is, well, you will get false positives as well as false negatives. You will reject benefits for people who maybe should be receiving them, people who have a genuine medical need, while also catching out some of the people who maybe shouldn't be claiming them. And that's why there's no obvious answer to that. I don't really know what to do about that, other than, I mean, my default answer when I don't know the answer is usually to say, well, rather than have a system where this stuff is all determined centrally and where it's the same across the country, why not localize it, and why not have a bit more experimentation with different ways of doing it, and so different assessment systems, different ways to administer the system, and also
But you
make
see,
sure that,
but
yeah.
yeah, no, sorry, beg your pardon, Christian. Yeah. Okay, but so if we don't have an answer, that's fine. But you see, the impression I've got speaking to people is that some people their response will be, well, look, these people need help, and it's probably a post-pandemic thing. And lots of people got knocked about in various ways by COVID, and the NHS is struggling at the moment because of backlogs, and so this is being reflected in more people seeking benefits. And other people would say, well, it's too easy to get benefits, and you can just phone your doctor up and say you're not very well, or fill out a depression form and tick the boxes that suggest that you're depressed, and then you can get benefits. So it's easy to game the system. And if your neighbours are on benefits, then why wouldn't you join in with them? Why would you do something different? So it would seem
And
to me
both
that
both of those things can be true at the same time.
I'm
But
so
but
no,
but
absolutely.
on the point of the pandemic, I mean, that's why I pointed out, we don't see this elsewhere. And the pandemic, I mean, by definition, a pandemic affects everyone, and this hasn't happened elsewhere. This increase in economic inactivity, in long-term economic inactivity, we don't see that anywhere else in the OECD. Pretty much everywhere else, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, the figures are more or less the same. Of course, as always, it goes up in some places, goes down in some places. But there, it's really, if we look at the rate of change, it's really Britain that is the outlier
So then
post-pandemic.
we could, in principle, one could look at the systems in place in different countries, look in France and Germany, as aforementioned, and other comparator countries, and look to see what their systems are for people to potentially access or not benefits. I mean, in other words, very simply, this is too crude, but to make the point, let's say in Britain you can phone your doctor and sort of plead that you're not very well, and it's likely the doctor signs the forms that you need. Is that the case in France? Or do you need to go to 3 in-person interviews before they sign you off? Whether that's right or wrong, but it would be possible, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be that difficult, I think, to compare countries and see if the systems are similar, to see if the explanation in the UK is one that it's too, in inverted commas, easy to get onto benefits, or that it isn't that, and that there's something else going on, that people are more, there are more people who need benefits in the UK, and then we can start to look at why on earth that is.
That's generally the right way to do things. Try to learn from best practice, because that's what we do normally in our private lives, and in the business world. You look at what's the competition doing, what are the successful ones doing, what do they get right. It's just that in this case, it's not that there have been many drastic changes specifically in those 5 years since the pandemic. And so therefore, whatever you can say about how the French system operates, how the German system operates, and so forth, that would have been true before the pandemic as well.
Okay.
And,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's not
true.
it's not really true that Britain has drastically changed the system either. It's just that for some benefits during the pandemic, a lot of controls were eased, where it was previously there would have been stricter checks if you wanted to sign up for various inactivity benefit claims. That was dropped during the pandemic, and fair enough, but not really brought back into the way it was before. But the problem with all of that is that, so we all know that we have an aging population, and for that reason we have rising fiscal pressure. You expect costs to go up for the pension system and the healthcare system because of population aging. What should and should not happen when you're faced with demographic headwinds of that nature is that you also have an increase in the number of working age people who are economically inactive, because then you really have a problem. We already have a working age population that is shrinking relative to the retired population. That's enough of a problem in its own right. We can't then afford to also have a shrinking working population as a proportion of the working age population.
So we've got a triple whammy, it seems to me. We got the audacity of people to live longer than they used to, which does cost money. We've got a shrinking working age population who are working, right? Working age population, and we've got not many babies. So in a sense, there's a triple whammy brewing, right? Where we're going to end up with a vast number we're going to get a reduction in population while at the same time a skew in that population towards older people. Seems to me the only way that could be solved is that, I don't know, AI makes us suddenly incredibly more productive.
That would be great, yes. Well, I mean, there could also be, so not all societies, not all welfare systems are equally vulnerable to this. It depends on the extent to which pension systems and to some extent healthcare systems are pre-funded, to what extent they come with their own capital reserves. And Britain is among the relatively better ones, although only just, in that most people do have private pension funds as well. So that is clearly a safety buffer that when you have an aging population, when you have rising life expectancy, and a higher share of older people, that in a system where most people also have their own pension funds, then pension fund wealth is going to grow alongside with the aging population. And then that makes it less of a problem. There are far better examples. So in Australia and Switzerland as well, I think the Netherlands to a lesser extent, there the vast majority of the pension system of old age benefits is based on savings, on pre-funding. And when you have a system like that, that's largely immune from demographic pressures. So, I mean, not entirely, because if you have fewer working age people, even the pension fund assets, they're only worth something if somebody does something with them. It needs to be invested. And if you have the whole population shrinking, then, well, there's just less to be invested in. But there you can have international diversification. You can invest some of that money in economies where the population is still growing, or where the economy is still growing. So it's less of a risk factor. Whereas on the other end, and that's again one of the things where, since you mentioned France, that's one of the things that they are terrible at, that they have almost no private pension fund wealth. And that means if you're a pensioner, or if you're approaching retirement in France, your entire old age income depends on political decisions. And that's why we see these massive demonstrations there every time that a politician a government wants to change something about the pension formula, say retirement age or the way the pension level is calculated. It's not just a political culture where strikes and demonstrations are more ingrained. And it's not just that they like going on strike all the time. It's not just that they like demonstrating and erecting barricades and all this folk mythology that this is somehow an echo still of the French Revolution. No, it's more that it is quite rational. If your entire income in old age depends just on political decisions, you invest more time and effort in putting pressure on the people who make those political decisions. Whereas here, it would be more like a half and half situation, where half of your income may come from government programs, the other half is your own pension fund wealth. And insofar as your income comes from your own prior savings, well, their political demonstrations won't help you very much. You have a certain amount of money in your pension fund, and striking and starting political demonstrations isn't going to increase that. So in an ideal world, we would have pretty much the entire pension system would be backed by savings.
The government debt is rising very quickly because we're borrowing a huge amount each month. And a lot of the money that we're borrowing, we're using to pay the interest on the debt that we already have at very high levels. Let me put it a different way then. Does it worry you that the debt that the UK have and the deficit, so the rate that debt is increasing, does that worry you? Or do you think, well, things come and go. At the moment, we're in a period of high borrowing, but the UK can manage it. That's not the real issue. There are other things we need to be doing, like building lots of houses and deregulating and so forth. Which side are you on with that issue? Do you think it's a big deal, or do you think it's not really the point of most concern?
I think it is a big deal in this case, because it's all well and good to have increased borrowing if there's a one-off factor where that's going to go away. So the fact that borrowing went up during the pandemic, okay, fair enough. That's hopefully a one-off. Hopefully there will never be a pandemic again in our lifetimes. And that's also why you sometimes hear these comparisons that actually at the end of the Second World War, government debt levels were much higher than now. Yes, okay. But there you had the option, you had something very obvious that you could cut, which was military spending at the end of the Second World War, which for a while consumed pretty much the entire public budget. And we don't have an equivalent of that today. There is nothing obvious that we can cut. There is no low-hanging fruit, nor is there going to be again, compared to at the end of the Second World War, it was, of course, once you lift that burden of an economy, you're going to have growth in the civilian economy. You will have a rebound effect in the productive economy happening. There is, again, no equivalent of that today. So we can't, it doesn't make sense to me to say, oh, well, but things looked worse in 1945 and therefore things are fine now. It's not just that debt is relatively high by historic standards and that it is still growing. It's also that there are no low-hanging fruits, neither on the expenditure side nor on the revenue side. There's nothing around the corner that's going to increase tax revenue massively, nor is there any government spending program where you can say, oh, well, that's obviously going to become redundant. We no longer need that, in the way that the massive military spending that you had during the war was, of course, no longer necessary after 1945. So therefore, yes, and especially if you compare more recently. So in the 2000s, Britain had a relatively good fiscal position, where for a while, debt, at least official debt, okay, there's the implicit debt on top of that, but at least the official debt was for a while not much more than 40% of GDP, where Britain was one of the better examples in the OECD, and where you also had a culture of political culture that valued fiscal prudence, where, including under a Labour government at the time, that they prided themselves in saying, we're not like our predecessors who spent money like drunken sailors. We do care about fiscal rectitude, where Gordon Brown marketed himself in that way, and largely true. It's just that you then had this ratchet effect first after the financial crisis, this massive increase in debt levels, and then again after the pandemic, and then at the same time you have growth in discretionary spending and these sort of entitlement programs that we talked about earlier. And what's different now, though, and what is a bit worrying, is that, so I remember the debates from the Cameron years, where they made some fiscal savings, and it was politically controversial, but there was a broad acceptance that you can't run deficits forever, that we don't want to end up like Greece or Italy, and we don't have that today. Now we have a government that is trying to make ends meet with the tax revenue they have, and they get a backbench rebellion over everything, and they can't get anything through. They have to U-turn on all their spending pledges, but at the same time, there are no obvious ways to increase tax revenue either, because there has never been a period during peacetime when Britain sustainably raised much more tax revenue than it does now. And that's the problem. We don't have the political, well, it wasn't a consensus either in the early 2010s, but there was more of an awareness. Okay, there is a fiscal problem, and I may not agree with the exact way in which this government is going about it, but I can see where they're coming from, that there was an acceptance that the fiscal situation was bad, and something had to be done. It couldn't just continue as now, and you don't have that now. We don't have the same political awareness that there is something badly wrong.
I agree. So if we don't have the awareness and we continue to borrow more than 10 billion a month on average, it happens to be particularly high as I understand it in June, what happens? I mean, can we just keep doing that because Britain isn't a person, it's a country, and so we can more or less just keep borrowing because it'll be okay? Or what do you foresee happens if we don't change course?
Well, I mean, okay, Britain isn't like a private household, but nonetheless, the market interest rate that governments have to pay for their borrowing, for the bonds that they buy, is variable, and it has already gone up. So there is a risk premium priced in. It's not that investors think, oh, well, Britain will always pay its debt and we don't have to worry about that. So Britain is, of course, not, say, Argentina before Milei or Greece in the early 2010s, but neither is it, say, like Switzerland, where they can very easily borrow and at very low rates because investors trust them. So it isn't true that Britain can just borrow as much as it wants. And then there's the fact that you mentioned, that it is already the case that a large proportion of government spending is basically just paying off interest on previous borrowing. So at some point it does eat into your current level spending, and it becomes a big part of public expenditure. It's something that people don't see. It's not going into the health service or the pension system or other things that we feel improve our living standards today. It's a payment for borrowing that happened in the past. What can happen there is that, well, first you will get an increase in populist proposals and in all kinds of political populism from the left and the right. I mean, basically, that's the problem here, that we have. The reason why it seems so hard to do anything on the expenditure side is, well, the economy isn't growing, and hasn't for quite some time, for most largely for the reasons that I mentioned. I'd argue for the NIMBYism, that Britain doesn't build stuff, that we had for nearly 17 years now, an almost stagnant economy in per capita terms. But nonetheless, Britain doesn't have a mindset of a stagnant economy. People want higher living standards, quite reasonably, I think, because we're nowhere near where the country could be. We're nowhere near the possibilities frontier, the efficiency frontier. There are economies that are considerably richer, and Britain could be one of those. So it's not like, I had this discussion ages ago when There was a predecessor of what is this fashionable degrowth movement now. There was a predecessor of that in the early 2010s, the steady state economy people, as they called themselves then. I had a discussion with them. Some of them said the problem with capitalism is that it relies on perpetual growth. A capitalist economy that doesn't grow collapses. I always said to them, that's rubbish. You could imagine a society where people simply decide, we're happy with the living standard we have. We don't want more than that. We're happy in material terms. And if that were the situation, you could have a capitalist economy that doesn't grow and it wouldn't be a problem. It's just that Britain is not that society. Britain is not a society where most people look at their material situation and think, that's okay, that's all I need. We have a situation where people want to be richer than they are, but the economy isn't growing. So how do people try to get their living standards up? Through politics, by demanding more from governments. But that's zero sum.
Perhaps they should demand more from themselves would be an alternative argument on that. But actually, I'm intrigued in what you say there, because I wonder whether it is part of the human condition, and I would say almost a tragedy of the human condition, that we're never satisfied, that we always want more, that it would be a mistake to imagine that we could reach a utopia. Okay, that's my words, not yours. So maybe utopia is pushing it a bit, but some sort of level where we sit back and say, no, we don't want any more. No, this is okay. I don't think human beings are wired that way. And I think it's one of the issues with being human beings, that we can be happier if we're richer and better off and healthier and less concerned about what's going to happen tomorrow, because our environment and our personal situation is better. But we're never fully happy. It seems to be inbuilt in us to want more. And evolutionarily, as a biologist, that makes sense. Do better, do even better, pass on more of your genes, all that business. So there may be an issue here with imagining that we would ever get to I bet in Switzerland, and I recognise that's a country you're particularly impressed by, and maybe Singapore as well to some degree. Sure, they're not perfect either, but they're a step or two ahead of the UK in some respects, as you describe it. But I bet you, if you speak to the average Swiss person, you can get them pretty annoyed about the state of what's going on in my canton, or oh, can't believe it's like this. I don't think human beings ever will decide we've made it, we're there.
Well, who knows? It could happen at some point in the future. And I guess it would be as many things you would need, say, if you had a group of people who make that fashionable. A lot of these things are driven by fashions. If you have a group of high status people who make that fashionable to say, in material terms, I'm done, I'm satisfied, that's all I want. And where, say, if we already have that to some extent. So where if you nowadays material status symbols would that in a previous decade, maybe for a previous generation, would have impressed people, are now considered vulgar. So if you went around with something flashy, a lot of people would say, well, that's a bit cringe, isn't it? They wouldn't be impressed by you showing, hey, look, I have money. And that is just a way in which societies can become less materialistic, that you change the social reputation that's attached to different lifestyles. So I could imagine a future society where people do decide, well, we have enough. It doesn't have to be the country as a whole. It doesn't need to be the entire population. If you have some people who are still materialistic and want more, then that's fine. But you could have just these competing lifestyles, and that is already a thing today.
But I wonder if people will ever fill that with health. Probably health is something people always could feel healthier, happier, living longer. But it's a slightly different argument. But it's an interesting point. Interesting point that you make. I'd like to move on to talk about tariffs briefly, because they've come not back into fashion exactly. I quite call it fashion, but they're certainly the talk of the town in terms of economics, because Donald Trump is very keen on tariffs and has been implementing tariffs. And I hear most people who are free marketeers saying that tariffs are a bad thing, because in the end, overall, people are poorer when countries put up barriers, and we should be taking down the barriers. And again, perhaps in the past, Britain was relatively good at this. I understand that maybe at some point in the past, it incurred tariffs from other countries when it was a very powerful nation, incurred tariffs from other countries, but often insisted on not putting up tariffs itself. Maybe that advantaged it in some ways. But, and I have a note here because I'm not smart enough on these things to be able to remember the arguments. But there's an argument to say that Donald Trump's tariffs, whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, have been quite successful so far. They've had very little very little effect on US inflation or on the employment rates to date in the US. There's been very little retaliation from the rest of the world. Even the EU, which is a relatively powerful economic bloc, has sort of whimpered, rather, one might argue. The US stock market is doing rather well. In fact, it might be at a pretty much an all-time sort of high or all-time weekly high at the moment. And the US government has got a load of helpful revenue from these tariffs already. What say you? I would imagine that you're generally anti-tariffs, but has Trump proved you wrong?
I don't think he has. No. Yes. So firstly, yes, I'm completely anti-tariffs for the simple reason that economies work best if you have a large enough market where people can specialize, and the larger the market, the better. Ideally, the whole planet should be a single market and a free trade zone, so that people in different areas can specialize on different things and get better at what they do and then trade with each other. That's the source of, or a major source of economic progress domestically. We clearly wouldn't want tariff barriers between, say, the north of London and the south of London, and or London and the rest of the country. And I see no principal difference between that and, say, an economy that happens to be a different country. That's in economic terms a completely irrelevant and artificial distinction. And but then we need to see that the US is a peculiar kind of economy. They are so large. Even if they were trying to be completely self-sufficient, I mean, that would be bad. They would be poorer than now, but they have such a large internal market that for them international trade is less essential than it would be for, say, you mentioned Singapore. I mean, they as a city-state obviously couldn't be self-sufficient for a day. They need to be integrated into the global economy. So if they try to impose Trump-style tariffs on themselves, they would instantly notice a massive drop in living standards. The US can get away with more, but that doesn't mean that it's a good idea. What matters is how well or how badly are they doing relative to where they would be without the taxes. So Trump, at the start, after he just got elected, he several times he mentioned this period in the late 19th century when the US was a high tariff economy, relatively speaking. That's the time when they industrialized fast and when they overtook Britain, which was then the largest, most advanced economy in the world. The US took that place then, and that happened at the time of high tariffs. And he believes into this mythology around that it's the tariffs somehow that made America rich. But there are economic historians that have looked at this, and they show that no, really, you had the fastest growth in sectors of the economy that were least affected by those protective tariffs. So it was rather, and where the tariffs had a big effect, that effect was a negative one, that it reduced productivity growth in protected sectors. So America did not industrialize because of the tariffs. They could have industrialized even faster and become even richer if they had adopted a free trade policy. It's just that they also had such a large internal market, even at the time, that they could get away with an economic stupidity like tariffs, but that doesn't mean that that it's a good idea. In the same way in which, so Keith Richards has been able to get away with an extremely unhealthy lifestyle for quite some time, and he seems to be a biological wonder. He's still going strong, relatively speaking, but you wouldn't draw the conclusion that therefore leading the kind of lifestyle that Keith Richards used to lead and still does to a much lesser extent, that either has no effect on you, or that is good for you. You wouldn't draw the conclusion that if you want to become a great guitar player, what you have to do is adopt the consumption habits of Keith Richards. It's more that he could be in an even better state if he hadn't led the kind of lifestyle that he had led.
So, okay. So despite the fact that these tariffs at the moment are, haven't affected employment rates, are bringing in huge amounts of money to the US. I mean, they're a big economy, so one has to factor that in. But, from a UK point of view, it's rather envy making. You would still say that overall this is bad, not only for the world in general, but for the US itself to have put these tariffs in place.
Yes, so I never predicted that there would be an economic meltdown. I've just said it's going to be comparable to what happened during the first term, when he already had that tariff obsession. That's a consistent theme of his. He's been talking about it since the 1980s. It's just that during his first term, he didn't do much with it. He had some selective tariffs, but even there, economists that have looked at this have found that his selective industry-specific or country-specific tariffs, they did raise consumer prices in the sectors that were affected by it. It may not be on such a big scale that you see it in the inflation figures, but it's still fair to say that a lot of consumer goods were more expensive than they otherwise would have been, making American consumers poorer in that regard. Now, there's no reason why tariffs should affect overall employment rates. That was never the argument. The overall employment rate, that depends much more on your labor market institutions. You can have, in principle, a situation where tariffs have a negative effect on some industries, but while protecting others, and you then have more people working in the unproductive industries, and the overall employment rate stays the same. It just means that you have people working in sectors where they shouldn't be working. They make stuff that they should really be buying from somebody else. So that's, say, the argument that Trump would say, some of his supporters would say, that tariffs save jobs, that if you have cheap Chinese imports, they destroy American manufacturing jobs, whereas what they really do is say, consumer goods come in from China, undercut US producers. Yes, some people will lose their jobs, of course, if you have a good where price matters a great deal and there's only so much you can do to improve quality or productivity. Yes, some American producers will go out of business. But the other effect is that if you pay less for household electronics, say, or whatever it is, say, say this device on which I'm recording this, say it may once have and did once cost huge amounts of money, and if it gets cheaper, be that due to technological advancements or cheap imports, effectively I'm richer. I spend less on a phone, a laptop, whatever else than I would have previously. I have effectively more money in my pocket. I'm going to spend it on something else. And in that way, I'm creating jobs in some other sector. And the overall employment rate stays the same, and that is pretty much what we see. So even in periods of that are described as deindustrialization, it's not that the overall employment rate goes down. It's not that you have fewer people in work. That stays more or less the same. It's just they work in different sectors. People get richer, save on the consumer electronics, spend more money on other things, say domestic tourism, that you have the entertainment, leisure industries grow because you no longer have to spend a lot of money on the bare essentials. So you spend more on leisure activities, and in that way you have a large leisure entertainment industry. People find jobs.
But I remember, okay, so you're making the argument that there's more money to go around in the end because things are cheaper to buy, so people are effectively richer because per dollar or per pound they can buy more with it. So it's the same as earning more money because you have to, right, okay. But I remember back in there, if I've remembered this correctly, Gordon Brown seemed very keen on the idea that it wasn't really worth British workers making lots of things, such as, for example, cars, although the British car industry is relatively large, smaller than certain countries, of course, but relatively large. Because actually, per car made, there isn't that much of a markup on them. But where you can make good money is, for example, the insurance for the car or the shipping of the car or sort of various, what would you call it, kind of tertiary element of the workforce. The paper pushing. Now, okay, maybe there's something in that. Don't be the people that make the items too much. I mean, high-end items are a bit different, and maybe cars isn't a great example, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, but be the people who do the paperwork, because you generate more money per person doing that. Well, maybe that's true, and that sounds great, but doesn't it miss something fundamental, which is that some people don't want to sit at a computer and, in inverted commas, push paper. Some people want to make things. Some towns have grown up around a culture, an identity that their town makes product X, or their family make product X, or they're proud when they come home at the end of the day and they can look behind them and see something that they've helped to build, whether it's a road or a house, or on a smaller scale, they've carved a wooden chair. So those things, a government might arguably want to defend those types of employment, those jobs, not because financially it's advantageous, but if I can put it this way, culturally it's advantageous, that some people want to do things with their hands and have the pride in seeing something visibly change, as opposed to this modern idea of sitting behind a computer and tapping away and theorizing.
Yes, that's clearly a factor, and that's why we did see, I guess, some of the support for Trump comes from that you have areas that have deindustrialized, and even though people are not in absolute terms worse off, or in absolute terms the employment rate may not have changed, may even be higher now, but you still have people who feel a cultural loss. And it is clearly true that some sectors of the economy can have an outsized impact on the identity of a region. That's why, say, when we say that, when you describe a place as a fishing village, what does that really mean? Does that mean that half of the workforce work in fishing? Probably not nowadays. It probably means it was a fishing village in that sense in the 17th century. Nowadays, it's probably far less than 1% of the population work in fishing, and it's probably far less than 1% of GDP that's generated in that way. What it means is that you have pubs that are called the fisherman's cottage, and that where their decoration is fishing nets and fishing rods and things like that. That's clearly the case. So, and I noticed, because I come from a wine growing region where I don't know what percentage of the workforce work literally in wine farming. I would imagine far less than it seems when you drive through it and you see the vineyards everywhere. But what it does mean is that nearly 100% of the population identify with it, and that you go to a place and you have, say, in pubs and restaurants, all the decoration somehow is related to winemaking, and that is clearly something that people identify with. That's all well and good, I understand that, but I wouldn't base policies around that, because there you're saying that the purpose of economic life shouldn't be to make useful goods and services that people want to buy. It's to preserve a lifestyle that say, this goes back to, that's why even so many years later, the miners, after the miners' strike, that's why in cultural terms the miners are almost universally considered the good guys, and why there's so much romanticism around them, that there's musicals and films in which the miners are these lovely salt of the earth types, and then there's evil politicians in Whitehall trying to destroy it. But I don't buy the idea just because your father and grandfather made some good that you have an automatic entitlement to keep making that if nobody wants to buy it.
Well, it's not
you have to
entitlement.
offer something that people want to buy. If nobody wants to buy the coal that you're mining, then do something else. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but okay, I'd put it slightly differently. I know it's entitlement, but you're right that you can't necessarily hold on to something to enable people to maintain their culture if it's financially unsustainable, or too financially unsustainable, because then the onus is on other people to then support the maintenance of that culture. Where you would draw the line on this, I'm not sure, because the risk is otherwise we're just focused on pure money making. And money's great, and I wish I had more, but it isn't everything, right? And so
well, but you can to some extent. For a lot of goods, you can see that they have a little Union Jack on the product, where they try to tell people, buy this. It may be a bit more expensive, but it's your local area. So if consumers really value that for identity purposes more than the pure utility of the product itself. You can do that. You don't need to force people to that, but it's just that where you solve these things through identity appeals, you may have a markup that is paid by people who value that identity aspect of the product, but you still leave people the option. If your attitude is, well, your lifestyle is your that's your hobby, that's your private business, I want to buy the best product, I want to buy the product with the best price performance ratio, you still have that freedom. Whereas if you should have that freedom. Whereas if you want to support, say, the local farmer or the local maker of this or that, and you react to a consumer signal that tells you this is made locally, this is made by somebody who lives in your area, and if you value that, that can itself become part of the enjoyment of the product, that you're not just buying a product, but you are contributing to a lifestyle and to a culture that you value, then that is something that can emerge out of the market. And it does. That's why we have products that try to market itself specifically in terms of local identity, connection with a local business. That's all well and good, but I wouldn't force anyone to contribute to that if that's not what they want to do.
And by forcing to contribute it, you'd mean that they're paying taxes to the government, and the government is using some of those taxes to prop up a failing industry because of its cultural value.
Either taxes or tariff. So that would have the same effect.
Well, they are taxes, I guess. But okay, so you're anti-tariffs, right? Fine. In which case, wouldn't it be a good time now for the UK to go back into the EU single market, where it wouldn't experience any tariffs, from other EU members?
I would never have left the single market in the first place. But that's something where people on my side of the argument, on the free market liberal side, were divided. Some thought Brexit could be a way to reclaim the free trading tradition of 19th century Victorian Britain, and that Britain could become Singapore on Thames and massively deregulate its economy. And I said at the time, well, that's not going to happen. It's not the EU which prevents Britain from being more like Singapore or more like Hong Kong. Okay. It's much more domestic political pressure. So I guess I don't want to start a Brexit discussion, because we've all had that argument a million times, and everything that can be said about Brexit has been said. But my preference was, I think, leaving the European Customs Union in isolation, that was justifiable. The idea that Britain can strike its own trade deals, including with economies in Asia and the Pacific region and so forth, that's a good thing. And that's an area where Britain has historically clearly differed from the rest of the EU, for the reason that you have English-speaking economies around the world, and partly as a colonial heritage, you have places with a legal system that's similar to the British one. So it's not surprising that Britain has more trade with India than, say, Luxembourg or Belgium have, and that's all well and good. So leaving the customs union, that made sense to me. Leaving the single market did not. So I would have, and again, going back to the Switzerland example, it really does solve a lot of things. When Switzerland has this arrangement where they're not entirely in the single market, but have a sort of associate membership with it and replicate a lot of what the single market does. The single market adjacent status, I thought that looked like quite an attractive arrangement. And they can, however, conclude trade deals, and they have some trade deals that the EU does not have. So that would have been like a softer Brexit. That was what I was in favor of. I would certainly also have kept freedom of movement within the European Economic Area, because there the irony is that a lot of what happened during the Brexit referendum, and even more so afterwards, was conditioned by this focus on immigration, that became the big issue during the campaign and later on, and that a lot of the people who voted Brexit didn't do so because they wanted to be Singapore or Hong Kong. I mean, that's maybe a dozen people, all of which work in the free market think tank sector. That's what I always said to the pro-Brexit people on my side of the argument always said, your reason for voting Brexit is not the reason why Brexit won. You have your reasons, and they're great, and I love them. I wish that was the basis under which Brexit had succeeded, but that is not what 17.4 million people voted for. That's maybe what 17 people voted for. That particular vision of Brexit, for most, it was really much more about things like immigration and an abstract notion of national sovereignty. But the irony is that, say, a lot of people voted Brexit because they thought this is going to lead to less immigration. And what then happened was the Boris wave, with immigration from outside of the EU going up to unprecedented levels. And when was it? 2 years ago or 3 years ago? There was 1 year when net migration was almost 1 million people, where even if you're very liberal on migration, you can see why that this is going to cause some problems, especially in an economy like this one, where we haven't built additional homes for 1 million people. We haven't built additional infrastructure for 1 million people. So yeah, where even the anti-migration Brexiteers didn't get what they wanted. Nobody really got from it what they wanted. I would have kept the old system. What was so bad about that? You had freedom of movement within the European Economic Area, and then a work visa system for the rest of the world.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah. No. Briefly on immigration, perhaps, and since you raised it, because it is a very pressing issue, and it's a very economically related issue. So until recently, the arguments seemed to be immigration boosts the economy, and so people would say, well, look, here's a plus side on the ledger for immigration, right? It boosts the economy. So if you want less immigration, you're going to have to accept a weaker economy overall, because people come to the UK and they work. I think there were arguments made that they're more often in work than the, let's call it, the native or the host population. So overall, it boosts the economy. So you may have concerns about immigration. Some people would consider those concerns xenophobic. Other people would consider them to be reasonable about, integration and cultural change and so forth. But you must bear in mind that you will be losing out economically if you cut immigration numbers. But recently, that argument seems to be losing ground.
Mm-hmm.
That actually, and maybe this is particularly with recent immigration, that, as you say, is broadly from outside of the West, actually, I mean, the EU predominantly, but the West, that actually that pro side of the argument for immigration, I'm not suggesting there aren't other pro sides of the argument for immigration, but that has been lost from the pro side of the ledger, that in fact, on the average, immigration is detrimental to the economy. Now, not only because, well, partly because we don't build the homes necessary for these people, and that's a British problem, as you described already, but also in terms of level of employment and the sort of employment that these individuals are able to find when they're in the UK, perhaps because they're not trained to do, certain high-level jobs that generate more productivity and more taxes and so forth. So given where we are now, well, perhaps you've already answered this, Kristian, but what would you do would you want to cut immigration levels substantially? Would you want to go back? Well, here's the old classic, isn't it, that people don't like to answer. I don't know if you will or not. Would you want net immigration to go back below 100,000? I say back below 100,000. In other words, should we go back to a situation where immigration is substantial, but much lower than it's been in recent times? Or is the economy in a situation where we need to accept some of the disadvantages or arguable disadvantages of immigration, because my goodness, we just need lots of immigration at the moment to help us get out of this very difficult economic situation that we're currently in?
Well, I don't think policy should try to target any particular level. Should neither try to increase nor drastically decrease it, because at the end of the day, migration numbers, like a lot of aggregate values, variables, you can talk about them in aggregate terms, the inflation rate or the rate of employment and of job creation and so forth. Ultimately, it's driven by lots of individual decisions. People make decisions to move here or to move out or not to move here. And it's not that politicians should try to aim for a particular level and saying, and this would be better than that. Ultimately, this is driven by hundreds of thousands of people making individual level decisions to either migrate or employ somebody or rent a house to somebody. So in an ideal world, we would just have a system where the housing market and public services and other things can adjust to the additional population, and where we wouldn't have to worry about that. And broadly speaking, in the market-based sectors of the economy, that is the way it works. You won't hear complaints from the supermarkets or from the pubs that they say we can't cope with more people moving to the area because our shelves are empty. That they will see that as a great opportunity. They will be happy that they have more customers. And ideally, if we had a market-based housing sector, and ideally the same in healthcare and other sectors, that providers would think of this as a business opportunity, thinking, oh, great, there's more people coming. Well, I give them what they want and I'll make money from it. And then we wouldn't have to worry about whether it's 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000. But that's clearly not the situation we have. And even though I'm on the more liberal side, I do accept that it's quite unlikely that we're going to change basically the way the whole country works just so that the country is more can be more better able to cope with migration numbers. If you try to do that, if you try to make the housing market, the healthcare system, infrastructure provision and everything else more flexible so that migration numbers don't matter, most voters will say, well, okay, but why don't we just cut migration numbers, and then we don't need all this other stuff. And that's always going to win out. So I accept that we are in a situation where the country quite clearly cannot absorb 1 million people per year coming in, and that's not going to change soon. Under those circumstances, a more restrictive policy than I would ideally like to see is justifiable. But I wouldn't do that by directly aiming for a particular number. So it's what happened after Brexit was the reason why we had the Boris wave was in large parts just that the salary threshold was cut massively. So for non-EU migrants, and well, it then became also binding for EU nationals, where before Brexit, if you wanted to work in the UK, if you wanted a work visa, you had to have a job offer already where you would earn at least £30,000. So that was more than what the median salary was at the time. You had to earn more than the median wage earner in the country. Otherwise, you wouldn't get a work visa. And depending on the sector, that number could be even higher. Now, if you have a demand of that sort, firstly, that's automatically going to limit numbers because there are only so many people who can earn that much, at least at the outset. And secondly, you're also making sure that pretty much all of them will be net contributors. So that's why all the old studies from the 2010s and before find that migration is broadly positive for the economy and that most migrants are net contributors. That was the case by design. Whereas if you then, and that's what Boris Johnson did, if you lower the threshold to below the median salary and you have lots of people coming in who earn less than the median salary but are entitled to some public services, then fewer of those will be net contributors. You will then have net recipients coming in, especially if you then also get an increase in people bringing in dependents, bringing in larger families. And that was the post-Brexit change. And for EEA nationals, for people from the European Economic Area, that was never the case. It was in principle always possible to come here and work for the minimum wage and bring people with you. So they have always had that easier system with lower barriers. It's just that their migration was just automatically biased towards more highly skilled people, because specifically Western Europeans move here for specific reasons, less so for economic reasons. They move here because they want to work in a particular sector that is underrepresented in their home country. things like that, you had an automatic bias towards more highly skilled people, if only because, say, in places like France, say, whether you're fluent in English or not, that is in itself an indicator of skill levels, that you could in principle always have had lots of low skilled French people moving here. It's just that wouldn't happen under free movement rules. They would normally stay there. The only ones who would come here would be the French bankers and highly skilled business people. That'd be the only ones who find it easy to move here. Apart, it wasn't about legal barriers. It's whether you want to live in Britain, and there was just an automatic bias towards more highly skilled migration, and that's why both from in the EEA and from outside of it, because of that visa system and the stringent requirements, it was broadly true that migrants were net contributors, fiscally and economically, and the numbers were lower, and there was less of a problem. So in hindsight, that system that the Brexit side was railing against during the referendum campaign and in the years later, I wish a lot of them would now probably want to have it back.
3 points in response, if I can remember them all. Yeah, one is the issue of dependence, because you can bring in somebody moves to the country and they're a banker or whatever it is, and they're generating lots of money. It's all very wonderful. If they bring lots of dependents, those dependents aren't bad people, of course, but yeah, they're costing the state money, and I think that needs to be factored in. It's not that one should never be able to bring dependents, but it needs to be factored into the calculations about what's wanted. Actually, if some of those dependents are children, that can be a good thing, given, as we mentioned earlier, there's a reduction in reproduction rate. But again, this needs to be considered, and we need enough school places and so forth. I think there probably are enough school places, actually, but there's that. I can hear my friend Ricky, who often gets a question asked on these podcasts. He's intrigued by the idea that if you had net negative migration for a while, house prices could come down because your supply and demand tilts. And so you could, in principle, and I guess this is very difficult to predict, you could, in principle, have a weakening of the economy depending on which migrants left and in what numbers. So people's wages go down, but in principle, they might end up being better off. They have more money in their pocket, effectively, as you discussed earlier in terms of tariffs. Because if house prices come down a lot, then people are better off because their rent or their mortgage repayments are lower. And thirdly, sorry, this is a lot to take on, but thirdly, if I may, similarly to your argument about the problems with tariffs, and I brought in this idea of what about culture? What about some people's wants to make things with their hands, let's say, even if it's not economically very viable, and you rebutted that, fine. But here again, with respect, your argument seems to be very, very fiscally focused. So people might be living somewhere and they're living with people that are culturally very similar to themselves. And then all of a sudden, 1,000 French bankers turn up, right, in their block. And these French bankers all making lots and lots of money. But if the host inhabitants really don't like snails and onions, right, then they're not going to be too happy about the fact that overall their economic situation has improved because of all these French bankers, but now they're just drowned in onions and snails. They might prefer to not have the economic uplift and not have to suffer all the onions and snails. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, but I don't see that as different in principle from, say, a situation where you have lots of Yorkshiremen moving in next door, and maybe or Scots or Welshmen, whatever. You're just going to have changes in your area, and sometimes you're not going to like them. It only becomes a problem when you have a group who want to force their preferences on other people, whereas snails and onions, well, okay, that would just be an offer. It could be that that is on offer more often in areas where you have lots of French.
Well, there is a concern, isn't there? There is a concern that those hypothetical French bankers with their hypothetical onions and snails might start to force that into the culture. I've not really thought about this before, might start to force that into the culture if they are the majority group. Now, then you might say, well, if they're the majority group, then so be it. It's their area, or, that always happens. The majority culture tends to dominate by sheer numbers. And then I guess you get into a tricky argument about, well, should the host population, the original population, their wants take precedence because it's their tower block or broader their country, or does that tower block or country simply morph and naturally become something different if the people on that piece of land are a different peoples? And I guess there's can be quite a big dividing line there between how people in terms of how people think about that issue.
Well, I would simply not have a situation where anyone can force cultural preferences on anyone else. But when it comes to things like just different preferences for food and drink, that's something that happens in the market. You can have a variety of offers. You can have maybe more French style bistros opening up, but they would not be the only thing that's available. You don't have to go there if you don't like it. You still have the option of and if there's enough people who want to go to a traditional pub, that would still be viable in that area. It's only a problem in areas where in politics, basically, where political decisions are either or, and you make a decision, and that's then forced on the whole country. And
but you're seeing that as top down. You're seeing that as top down. So I'm interested in this because I'm interested in drilling into this. So a lot of what you say is quite compelling to me. And I don't know too much about these things to have a very clear, defined opinion. But a lot of what you say is quite compelling. But I do get the sense that I'm repeating myself a bit here, that you're very keen on what individuals want in terms of what is fiscally best for them, and that in the end things will happen from a bottom down process where people choose, the market decides. But this, for me, and I think that's great in many ways, and I guess I'm perhaps falling into what you think is a sort of a trap of primeval human thinking about the world, that we need these top down controls. And my sense is we need some top down controls in terms of rates of immigration. That high immigration could be good in some situations. I'm not saying it isn't, but that it would concern me that we would allow high immigration through a policy of let happen what broadly lets happens. People will move where they want to move, need to move. Their bistro will work. Bistro will work if people want to buy products from their bistro, and it won't if it doesn't. That seems to forget this idea that this issue that we've seen in Britain and many other Western countries recently. How can I put this? And I think some people would say, I grew up in an area with this culture. This is what I was born into. This is what I'm kind of wired up to understand. This is what I like. This is what my family like. And it's changed very, very rapidly. And I don't want that. It's not whether I don't have to go to the bistro and buy something or not. It's not just about the markets. It's about the markets and other things, I might say more fundamental or more just in the ether around me. I want it to be more like it used to be in terms of the entirety of the culture and the environment, which includes many things that are commodifiable, but not just those things.
Well, I mean, if there is a demand for that, you could then still have whole areas that market themselves by saying, and in an ideal world, I would even have private neighborhoods organized more or less like businesses, and some of them could market themselves as saying we are like the British seaside town of the 1960s. We're specifically selling this traditional lifestyle that you may have a romantic attachment to, and if that's what people want, that could be a business idea in its own right. It really clashes of preferences really only become a problem where we have areas where we have to make collective decisions for everybody. So going back to the bistro example, and I don't want to trivialize this, but if we had a national restaurant service or a national leisure service, then of course we would have political decisions about what should they offer. These national restaurants, should they be traditionally British, or should there be some room for this or that migrant culture? And these would be political decisions. Maybe we would have a referendum or whatever. And in the same way, nowadays we get the problems in areas where where we have collective decisions that affect everybody. So there was this famous story that was making this famous news story that was making the rounds about the teacher who showed a cartoon, what was supposed to be a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, and then got threatened by a group of parents of Muslim parents living nearby, or some initiative, and where then the school had to make a decision and sided with the parents and against the teacher. I think the teacher was suspended. But that's an area where education is nationalized, and we have to make a collective political decision. What should education be like? Should it be secular? Should it should it cater to religious minority sensitivities? And whereas in a marketplace you would just have lots of different offers, where some schools would say, well, look, we don't care about religious sensitivities. We teach in a secular fashion. If you don't like that, don't come here. And others would say, well, we are either a religious school or a school that is very respectful and sensitive around religious areas. We won't go there. And you can make that choice. It becomes a problem where we have things like, say, what's happening now, debates about should there be blasphemy laws, should there be censorship, should there be an official definition of Islamophobia, and should that have an impact on what you can say on social media? Should there be laws around this stuff? That's where, well, every time we adopt a law, we adopt a policy, that gets imposed on the country as a whole, and then we have to agree. And then we have, when you have lots of people with very different preferences, then you're going to get a clash between them. Whereas if you just said, well, this is a matter of free choice. Different social media platforms can have their own policies. Some can be, say, Blue Sky is probably much more stringent nowadays than Twitter, and they work this out for themselves. And there will be some that you don't like. Don't go there.
So okay. So we take that the picture example of the Prophet. And so because there were some parents whose children were going to that school who were of the Muslim faith and of a predisposition that you shouldn't show pictures of the Prophet, they got upset about this. And I think that teacher is probably still suffering the consequences of his choice. Okay. But what about if someone showed a picture of, a foolish thing to do, of course, but showed a picture of the Prophet on a public street? Then some people would come along and have a problem with that, and he or she would get into trouble. Again, a lot of people would say that just shouldn't be an issue, because at some point in the past in the UK, I'm not sure how long ago, you could have done that and no one would have batted an eyelid, because no one would have probably known what the picture was, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And now things have changed so that actually you can't show even a cartoon picture of somebody without genuine risk. And they don't want that. And so with hindsight, they'd have rather have not had a change in their culture that meant that they've gone from a situation they thought was better, that you could show this picture with no one caring, to a situation where you can't show it without being fearful of your life. But it sounds to me like your arguments would say, well, you have to accept that change. That if enough people want to not like seeing pictures of Prophet Muhammad, then they're entitled to, and that you'd perhaps generate different areas in the country, like mini cantons, mm-hmm. where in some of those people it's blasphemy to show the Prophet, and in other cantons it isn't. Have I got that about right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, that would ideally not be a canton. A canton is still a public area, even if it is a smaller one. Ideally, on private property, you should be able to set whatever speech laws you like, and you could have, in principle, a privately owned street run as a business, or a privately owned even neighborhood run as a business, and they could say, here, no pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, and that I'd be okay with. When it comes to public spaces, there, unfortunately, we have to agree, and that's the whole problem. Even there, though, I would say it's less about immigration per se. It's more about the way we deal with it. We have political authorities that chose to in this case, that chose not to uphold free speech laws and to say, well, sorry if you're offended, but that's just the way we do things here, and you have to live with that. But that chose to take this view that their role is to minimize community tension, and they should that they have to clamp down on everything that could upset their interpretation of community cohesion. If you manage migration in that way, then you get what is described as asymmetric multiculturalism.
And right, and so part of that management is going to be rate of immigration, is it not? Because in principle, you could have a huge number of people rock up in your town or wherever you're based and say, no one's allowed to have a beard, let's say, okay, because you have a beard, lovely beard. And so you might be disappointed if you had to lop it off. Okay. Now, you might say, well, if there were rules maintained, which I believe would be the case in the UK, that no one can tell you that you can't have a beard, as long as we held to that, then you'd be able to keep your beard even if there were lots of people relatively quickly appeared in your town. Again, of course, this is entirely hypothetical. I don't think there would be people who would do that. Would there anywhere in the world? But anyway, whatever. So and so that would be stopped. But first of all, you might nonetheless feel tremendous, let's say, peer pressure or threats, basically, depending on how these people operated anyway. There might be a limit to how well you felt the police were going to enforce the law of people are allowed to keep their beards. And moreover, in a democracy, that can be, well, would we call it usurped? I mean, maybe it's not usurped. If you have enough people with the vote who move to your area and let's say vote for the mayor, who has the powers to say whether you're allowed to have beards or not, then you could find that enough people move into your area that in the end they take control of the system by sheer number, despite things put in place to stop that happening because of logistical limitations, financial limitations, and you end up having to cut off your beard. Do you see what I mean? That seems to extend outside the realm of let the free market do as it wishes.
Yes, so in my ideal system, a lot of things would be very decentralized, but you would still have constitutional protections, and they would say, well, whether you want to have a beard or not, that's not the business of your local authority. They should run, they can have lots of differences in how they want to run the local park or whatever, but that's not their business. But yes, I guess you could have places where there would be strong peer pressure. But that's again in a free society something that we have to live with, and it is already the case today. So irrespective of the demographic composition of the population, say even within the non-migrant part of Western societies, we've had various moral panic over the years. Say 4 years ago, a lot of people would have been very afraid to say anything critical of BLM, of Black Lives Matter. That there was this online hysteria that their supporters seemed to dominate everything, and cancel culture was absolutely a thing. Or say people saying that they think gender is biological and binary. And that there were people who were harassed out of academic positions. So that there was this story about Kathleen Stock, where a feminist academic who has gender critical views and faced lots of pressure from her students and the university administration, rather than saying, well, sorry, this is our colleague, and we have a culture here of free academic inquiry. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. That they didn't have the courage to do that. They sided with the student mob, and that's unfortunate. But we've never seen a society without peer pressure. It's ideally, I'd love to live in a society where most people are instinctively classical liberal and have a live and let live attitude, but we're not wired that way. We are judgmental about what other people do, and the best we can do is find a system where so you have different competing centers of power. So in this particular academic that I mentioned, she was sort of cancelled in the sense that I think she was bullied out of that university, but found a different position, and that's the way to do it. The market offers alternatives.
Yeah, okay, no,
You can go somewhere.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, gender isn't isn't binary. Sex is binary. I don't know what gender is, but it's a small point. But I agree with what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. But secondly, I guess two things. I'm pursuing this. I think it's very interesting. Two things. First of all, I think a lot of people would feel right that they want that unit of coherency. Right, so rather than dividing up into, let's say, towns or whatever a canton is, or a street or whatever, where you can have certain rules for certain people, where you can show pictures of certain things or you can't, or you can have beards or you can't, or you can have onions and snails all the time or you can't. That unit level would be the unit of the country. That you'd have to draw that unit size at some level. And that the nation, I'm not very good at putting this eloquently, it's not something I've thought about a lot, but the nation is the largest size unit of us, of we as a group. So maybe some people would be screaming at the YouTube at the moment and saying, some of the students might be saying, yeah, we agree with what Dr. Niemietz says, but we think that should be at the level of the country, because that, in a sense, is ours. So that's one point, and the other point is I just think, and we batted this back and forth, so I don't think there's an end point here, and that's fine, of course. But I think it seems to me that hyper-liberalism or free market liberalism, not quite the same thing, just has to be careful about being so liberal that a lot of people move into that successful economy, let's say, created by all this wonderful free marketness, who are very illiberal. And then take control in ways that the liberals, or whatever you want to call them, the free market people, get caught out by, that it overpowers their system. So they might have this idea that this will work if you let it be, and you have some top-down centralization, but only very limited, and then you let these subgroups do as they want, that gets usurped. And I think that's the concern of a lot of people, for example, in the West at the moment, rightly or wrongly. I mean, it's beyond me to know. But that they feel that if things change too quickly, that these assumptions we make about how free markets and freedom of speech can work, they get lost. So that your ideas are arguably very good ones. You think they are, probably, and written hugely about and thought about them for many decades, that your ideas are very, very good ones. But if you allow it to loosen too much, they can kind of get flushed down the sink, because something else comes along that overpowers and loses it. That's not an argument against your point of view. It's just saying that you need to have some sort of semblance of a moat around this. Otherwise, you lose the whole thing, or you're at risk of losing the whole thing.
Yeah, so that would be if you were arguing with a complete open borders libertarian, that would be a fair point. But that's one reason why I'm not one of those. So there are people, some of them have written for us, who are complete libertarian purists on this, saying immigration controls are completely illegitimate, should be scrapped overnight. We should have a system like in the 19th century, where you don't even need a passport, and national borders are fictional anyway. I'd say it is legitimate to say, well, an immigration system should prioritize and be easier and more permissive for more culturally similar countries. That's what was good about the old freedom of movement rules within the EEA that we've talked about there. That was never really an issue. Integration was never really an issue. And yes, you may have, say, Polish shops opening up, and that may have seemed new to people in 2004, 2005, when you suddenly had this big wave coming in, but ultimately people get along, and you just have, say, different beers in the shops, and that's it. But it is fair to say not the whole world is like that, and it's legitimate to say we want a system where you have where your migration policy isn't the same vis-a-vis the whole world, where you have a two-tier or three-tier system, and as we had before, where we had freedom of movement within the European Economic Area, visa system for the rest of the world, and I don't see anything wrong with that. And so I would have say the exact composition would have been different if it had been up to me. I've often heard this argument, but why can the Frenchman walk in without a visa, but the Australian needs one? Well, that was always a domestic choice. The British government pre-Brexit could have said, we also want freedom of movement with Australia and with New Zealand, because we don't really see them as foreigners, and yeah, they sound a bit different, but that's about it. If that's that was always a possibility. That was always a domestic political choice. They could always have said, okay, the Western world, Western Europe, or nowadays, I guess pretty much Western and Central Europe, North America, Australia, the developed English-speaking world, they're so culturally similar, they're not really foreigners. Freedom of movement, completely open borders for them. For the rest of the world, we have a visa system where, which ultimately, even though it is economic criteria, it does have a cultural filter as well. So if somebody comes in from a culturally very different place, but comes here to work as a banker or whatever, they're probably not the sort of people who will demand that their cultural norms are accepted. They will be also, in a cultural sense, somewhat westernized and more educated. So those will not be the people where the cultural tensions come from. And I think that's perfectly legitimate to have that sort of have, say, 2 or 3 very different migration systems for different parts of the world, depending on.
And there's an irony, I think, that one of the reasons or perhaps the main reason, sorry, the British government limited the number of Australians, Canadians, and so forth coming to Britain. Yeah, it wasn't due to their accent or the fact they have smaller vocabularies, but because they were trying to keep the headline rate of immigration down, and because they couldn't. No, you're saying that that's not the right thing to do, so fine. But because they were trying to do that, and there were lots of Europeans coming to Britain at the time, which I guess you would argue it suggests something positive about the UK, that therefore the Australians and the Canadians and so forth were losing out, which does seem a bit balmy. Right, because actually, yeah, it would be open to debate, and I have no opinion on this, I promise you, about how culturally compatible the French and the Germans are relative to the Australians. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's fairly similar, of course, France and Germany, but it is extraordinary how you can say fly from Britain to Australia. I mean, this is personal experience. Britain to Australia, you go right around. So typically, as you leave the UK, as with many countries, very simply put, the further you go, the more culturally different those countries are, right? And that kind of makes sense. But it's like you kind of wrap all the way around to the bottom of the world from a British point of view, and suddenly, although the environment is somewhat different visually, you can talk to people, you can joke with them, you can use colloquial language. Almost perfectly, as if nothing's really changed. And of course, the economic system, the legal system, and so forth is very, very similar. So it's particularly bizarre that Britain limited immigration from those countries, at least relatively to even relatively culturally similar countries such as France and Germany, which are, of course, relatively culturally similar, but actually, relative to Ireland, Australia, and Canada, not that similar. It's all relative. Kristian, I've just spotted the time. I don't think I've ever done a chat this long. I've got
almost 2 hours.
Almost 2 hours.
Time
flies when you're having fun. I was certainly having fun. It's been extremely enlightening and educational. I feel bad in 2 ways. There's lots of questions and really good questions that students have sent to me that they wanted to ask you, but I don't want to take up more of your time today because it's already lunchtime.
Part 2 then, from the sound of it.
I've never asked, take this as a massive compliment. I've never asked someone for a part 2, and would you at some point in the future have time for a part 2?
Yes, sure.
Well, you're very kind and very generous with your time. Very impressed. I'm going. So we'll leave it. We'll leave it there. Oh, I'm going to finish on one question, which was my friend Ricky's question that I did just raise, but we didn't get to. So perhaps if you can give a little answer to this, and that'll keep him happy. This is key. It's hard to predict. Yeah, in principle, It's hard to predict what will happen, economic knock-on effects when you make some big decision. I understand that. But as I mentioned before, in principle, if over a period of time we had a net negative migration, which seems incomprehensible actually, because we're so used to high levels of migration and whether they should be lower or not, and whether they should be capped, and we've talked about that. The idea that you actually might have a net negative migration seems almost incomprehensible. But then in a sense, that makes it interesting. Because so what would happen if we had net negative migration? Would that necessarily be a bad thing? Well, one point that's been made is if you did have net negative migration, you'd change the supply demand on housing because you'd have less people, homes, you have less people for a number of homes. And so in principle, net negative migration in a direct economic sense might hurt the country. Of course, it depends who's leaving and in what numbers and so forth, but it might well hurt the country. But what if house prices dropped a lot because the supply relative demand had improved greatly? That could end up that could improve people's economic standing. Is that in principle at least a reasonable argument?
Yes, sure, that could happen. It's just that strikes me as a very costly way of achieving that aim. You could then say, well, if we had, say, a new mutation of COVID coming along that kills half of the population, that would also reduce housing demand. And for the surviving half of the population, housing affordability would have improved. Yes, okay, true. It would just be a somewhat costly way of achieving that if we have the alternative of just building more stuff.
And do you think in Britain, so Britain is what, half the size of Germany, nearly a third the size, or maybe slightly bigger than that of France. So people don't always realise that it is a substantially smaller land mass. Now you need to factor in mountain ranges because you can't really build much in mountain ranges, but a lot of Scotland is mountainous anyway. So the effective usable land mass in the UK for a similar population to France and Germany, a little bit smaller than Germany's, but nonetheless, is a lot smaller. Is it, or maybe this isn't your area of expertise, but is it really viable to keep building lots of houses, or in some physical sense, bearing in mind we probably do need some fields for agriculture, although you might argue we can import it all. Do we really have space to keep building large numbers of houses?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the physical constraints, they are so far removed that I won't even bother to think about them right now. At the moment, only about 1/10 of the entire landmass of England is developed. And if you almost 2/3 of the land is farmland. And yes, some of it is needed for farming, but there we have the price mechanism to work this out. If you just gave the farmers building rights, development rights, it would be up to them to work out, is it more viable for me to keep using this land as farmland, or do I sell it to a house builder? And I wouldn't want to requisition it forcibly from them. It would just be, given where we are, massive housing shortage, massive lack of land for building, and loads of farmland. I would imagine lots of farmers would say, in this situation, I'm going to sell to the developer. And then rather than having just 1/10 of the landmass developed, it could be 11% or it could be 12%. And that would mean that would be enough space for millions of houses. It would still be the sort of difference that where we're talking about individual percentage points. So it's a sort of difference where you wouldn't see it from a plane. If I was in charge of house building and we had, say, a repetition of the 1930s building boom, you have once again the housing stock growing by 3% a year. That was the rate briefly in the 30s. That would make a massive difference to people's quality of life and affordability and so forth. But if you, say, spent 10 years abroad and then came back, it's not that you would see that. It's not that Britain would, from an airplane, look a lot more developed and built up than it was before. It would still be a kind of difference that you wouldn't even be able to spot with the naked eye.
It's
So
not
I'm
just
sure
the
that,
houses. It's not just the houses. It's the roads. It's the infrastructure.
yes,
It's all this
that's
business.
factored in already in the 10% figure that I mentioned. That's more than houses. That's everything that's in any sense built upon. That includes every road, every railway station, every industrial site, all of that. If you just increase that by, say, 10% or 1 percentage point of the landmass, that will be enough
Where would
to.
you build? Which part of the country?
Well, firstly, I'm not a central planner. I don't believe
Right.
in drawing up a 5-year plan and saying build here, build there, build there. I would just give the right to build in lots of places, pretty much anywhere that isn't. So okay, there are some land use protections that I'm okay with, areas of outstanding natural beauty, fair enough. But say most of the green belt is low grade agricultural land. I would absolutely give them the right to develop that. And London would then probably just grow outwards. You would have some upward building as well, and you would get a continuation of what was happening in the 1930s, while a lot of outer London was built.
Gosh, one more question on this, and I will let you go for now. How much would you control the nature of those buildings? So one concern that many people have, and maybe it's overdone actually, is that the quality of housing stock or home stock, it don't have to be houses, home stock, if that's a phrase, hasn't been very good, that their homes have been small. I think the second smallest in Europe after Italy or something. So,
Yes.
and some of these places, and there's some very near to me, quite nice design actually. But when you get close to them, you realize the front door is weirdly just a bit small. And everything's just a little bit miniaturized, right? And I think it was like a trick, a planning trick it really grim actually, I think. So there's that issue. There's a lot of places but I think this is improved now where they don't have, I'm talking again, high rise, where they don't have balconies. So you can't step out onto the balcony. You can open a door onto just a balustrade or whatever, but it's just up against the window. So you can't actually step out and have a seat and read a book outside. I don't know. So science, garden space, albeit communal garden space, and so on and so forth. So sorry. So as a free marketeer, might you argue that house builders should be able to build basically whatever they want because the market forces will encourage what people are prepared and want to buy and want to live in? Or has that gone too badly wrong that there should be some top-down control about quality of housing?
Well, we have top-down control now, and a lot of these irritating features, they are themselves the result of building design regulations. That's why a lot of the nice buildings that were built in the 30s would be illegal now. They would violate some building code. So it's I think it's especially when it comes to windows, and I don't know the details about this, but there are some of the irritating things that we see are directly a response to building regulations. So the design codes and get it wrong, and that's why I would say, well, we don't have car design codes. It's just in the car maker's best interest to make the kind of cars that people want to buy, because they're not just functional as cars, but also visually appealing. Now, why don't we see that in the housing market? Well, apart from the distorting regulations that we already have, it's simply because if land is so expensive because it's rationed, then you have to make cuts somewhere else. And then aesthetics, things that are visually pleasing but not strictly necessary, that's discretionary. That's why you make cuts. That's where you say, well, I'm already forking out so much for the land. And I think nowadays, most of the price of a property is just the price of the land. The physical structure, that's a very small part of it, used to be the other way around. In the 30s, the land price was less than 10%, I think, of the price of a house, and it's now the bulk of it. If land was cheap because we made lots of it available for development, then you would be able to say, okay, the land is so cheap, now I'm able and willing to fork out a bit more for nice design. And then you would automatically get improvements in the way that's what you see in more liberal systems. So in my former hometown, you can quite clearly see when stuff was built. There's a lot of ugly post-war development built in the 50s because everything was bombed out. They quickly had to rebuild things, and at that time, our country was poor. They didn't care about whether it looks nice or not. So you can still see that a lot of the 50s architecture, terrible. Then you go a bit outside, you see the stuff that was built in the 70s. There you can see, okay, that's the result of the economic miracle. People had more money. They were willing to spend more on something that looks nicer. And then they're basically the newer, the better, because people were richer, and as people get richer, they are prepared to spend more on nice things.
There's a 100 block apartments being built next to me, They're very nice looking, actually. I think it's been very well landscaped and so forth. Over 5 years, and there's still no one in them. Over 5 years. It says it all in the UK. Kristian, thank you so much again for your time today. We're going to have a part two at some point. I will leave you alone for a bit, and then I will slide back into your DMs or whatever the youngsters say. And we're going to talk about things like why Gary Stevenson's right, and why net zero's right, and why devolution in Scotland and Wales is so awful, and why we need lots of regulation. Right.
Sounds great. Can't wait.
So hopefully that will entice you to come back and push back on all of that. In the meantime, where can people find more Kristian?
On Twitter at K_Niemietz. And you can read my stuff on, well, I've got several books and papers. Most of them are on the website of the IEA, iea.org.uk.
Wonderful. And people, when they're on Twitter, they need to be nice to you, though, right? People should be nice on Twitter.
They should ideally. I'm not always nice on Twitter.
You're nice if they're nice, I trust.
Roughly, yes.
Kristian, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. See you in part 2.